Common question I get when I take people on my tours, especially if they've come from Rome and the Vatican and they've visited the Vatican museums, is, did everyone go around naked in ancient Greece and Rome? To which one answers, of course not. Especially if they come visiting in winter, I say, bloody hell, it's freezing out there, can you imagine? So no, people did not go around naked in ancient Greece and Rome, but rather there was an idea of the body that was very different than the idea of the body that we have today. The Greeks thought the body was, especially the male body, was something extraordinary. In fact, who do they represent in their statuary? Athletes, gods, semi-gods, and that is because for them the body was this perfect machine, and in its perfection it had to be represented. Obviously the representation will not be an anatomical representation, but rather will follow certain canons that will be repeated through time. But we do find some extraordinary pieces in which the male body is represented with exquisite beauty and perfection. That is the naked men. What happens to the naked women? They didn't go around naked either. Rather, especially in Greece, they were forced to be dressed, and they dressed a lot. We're confined to the home, being that it was a highly patriarchal society, and we will see the representation of the female body in a different way. If I use the example of Venus, first we find her clad, then we find her semi-clad, maybe showing and bearing one breast. And then we will find her maybe as other female figures represented with a thin veil hiding her body. And then we will jump into full nudity with the representation of the pubic Venus. The pubic Venus, that is the figure that is hiding her pubic area, and her hands are also covering her breasts. Not touching, not fully covering, but
gliding over.
Yeah, her breasts. What happens next? My joke usually is with tourists, everyone gets dressed because it's bloody cold out there. And with the fall of the Roman Empire, everyone gets dressed. And why is that? It's due to the fact that we are in a phase and I'm going to refer now to Italian history, of chaos, of disruption, in which slowly the church becomes a dominant factor, and images will have a different function. They will no longer represent those heroes, those athletes, and those gods. Rather, images will become the poor man's Bible. Hence, they will have the function of conveying religious and information to illiterate people. So what happens to all those naked images that we see running around in ancient Rome and ancient Greece? They don't disappear, but rather they're stored away, they're hidden, they are buried, and those traces will remain specifically in Italy, but the dominant language will be a religious language, and the dominant imagery will be religious. When do we see these figures slowly re-emerging in Italian society and in Italian art? In the 1300s, we start seeing, 13 and 1400s, we start seeing clearly from a classical model, from a Greco-Roman model, images in the nude that have been Christianized. In the pulpit of Pisa, Nicola Pisano conveys a Venus-like figure that will represent temperance. For example, on the portals of the Cathedral of Florence, we have on a relief, on one of the portals, on the reliefs, the marble reliefs of one of the portals, we will find a Apollos-like figure and an Apollos-like stance, first presented frontally and also from behind. We find images represented in the nude in very simplistic and sometimes macabre ways within the scenes of hell, where we find the damned often represented in the nude, or obviously in scenes representing the creation with Adam and Eve. And those will be more or less the events and more or less the occasions in which we see the nude represented. What happens in the 1400s? In the 1400s, slowly there is specifically in Florence, there is a recovering of those canons of the classical world. So that representation of the body that we find and we can associate with ancient Greek statuary, then copied and re-elaborated by the Romans. And this is the phase of Renaissance. So what happens in Renaissance and why Renaissance and why Florence? First off, we have to think of Florentine society. Florence in the 1400s is a republic, and being a republic and not a kingdom or a bishopric or a city ruled by a autocratic figure, rather by a pseudo-democratic institution, the republic, we have a society in which extremely wealthy merchant bankers are competing among each other on who has the biggest library, the most interesting philosophers, scholars, who has the most important artists, and so forth. And this competition among these wealthy individuals will lead to the development of humanist thought in those libraries that, the collections that they are commissioning libraries for will be accessible by scholars, and scholars will be translating from Greek, from Hebrew, from Latin, from Arab, and bringing knowledge back to light. So commissioning their scholars to translate these books. And what are they referring to? They're referring to Greek philosophy, to Platonic thought, and as they are referring to Greco-Roman philosophy, but not only, they're also coming up with this new idea of man. The idea by which man is made of body and soul, the body being instinct, and the body being a prison, but the soul, for them, the mind, could ascend to higher states of being, and could determine its own destiny. So this is a radical change, and this is the modern man, and this is what will lead to us and how we perceive ourselves as individuals who can determine their own destiny. And this radical change is creating a seizure or a separation with the medieval mind, which was the mind by which my life on earth is sin, my afterlife will be hell. So my life is determined by religion and by a very strict religious view. Obviously, who is connecting to these ideas? The elite. The elite could be, the elite were in Florence the merchant bankers. The elite in Florence was also the clergy. It will be an elite that we will also see in Rome, in the papacy, because the only way by which you can explain what you see in the Vatican museums that extraordinary connection of pagan images, of Apolluses, of Zeuses, of Venus, of fauns, centaurs, etc., bacchanals, etc., is by referring to a clergy, whether it's popes, cardinals, that are connecting to these ideas that we find emerging 50 years earlier in the Florence of the 1400s. In fact, I think that most of you who have visited the Vatican, when you see the Sistine Chapel, when you visit the Sistine Chapel, when you see those examples of nudity within that extraordinary environment, you will raise not one but two eyebrows. But it's all explained by what we see happening in Florence. How can these images of nudity emerge in that environment if not by finding elements that can be combined together? In the sense that we can find a Christianization of pagan images and a paganization of Christian images. It's that same logic that we find, for example, within the Vatican, and I always think of, when I think of nudity in the Vatican, I always think, and of this connection, I always think of the scene in which God is infusing life into Adam. Now those famous fingers, and how can Michelangelo create that extraordinarily beautiful Adam who is showing his full nudity in the ceiling in which popes are elected, if not by saying that, which is also what the Greeks in a way are affirming, that God creates Adam as his image, and as his image he is perfection. And this is the bit, the scheme that allows an artist like Michelangelo to celebrate in the Sistine Chapel on the ceiling, but more than on the ceiling, on the scenes of the Divine Judgment, where everyone is naked. Think of all those saints now. All the saints are presented naked, and that celebration of the body by this connection, this extraordinary connection that in a way authorizes this type of imagery. So, what we see in the Vatican can happen because of what was happening in Florence. And on regards to nudity and on regards to the revolutionary pieces that we find in Florence, the revolutionary sculptures that we find in Florence, you can't not refer to Donatello's Bronze David being the first, and this is so interesting, being the first male nude statue since antiquity of a certain dimension. And that is mind-blowing if you think 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, Donatello can create that extraordinary piece for the Medici that will be housed in the Medici Palace. The bronze ones, that will be housed in the Medici Palace. And within this extraordinary environment of philosophers, scholars, artists, and so forth, bankers, merchants, and so forth. So you have that example, which is one step in this revolution. The next example that you find in Florence, and if we go chronologically, would be the Birth of Venus by Sandro Botticelli. In the Birth of Venus, we find Botticelli using the model of the pudic Venus, the Venus hiding her private parts. But unlike what we find in a Greek example, where the body is conveyed according to geometries, order, stability, structurality. What we find in Botticelli is this extraordinary use of lines, but when you look at the detail, the last thing that Venus is solid. She has this extraordinarily beautiful face. She is created with these delicate, wonderful curves, lines, which are nearly poetic, but she doesn't present that structure of a classical, of a Greek nude. You can build a house on top of her, whereby on a Greek statue you can't put a house, you can't put a structure, because they are structural. No, they have a very powerful form. So what is Botticelli doing? Botticelli is in a way presenting this new Venus, but he's using the canons of Gothic art and the canons of idealization and of ideal beauty that are emerging in his time. What does he achieve? He achieves, which we can see in Greek art in the representations of bacchanals and of fights and of wrestlers, he achieves an incredible dynamism. And that is conveyed with something that we see in Greek art and in Roman art, which is the depicting of figures with beautiful veils. And it's the folds of the veils, the sculpting of these veils that manages to convey a sense of movement. And that's what he takes. In fact, Romina, think of when I walk through the Uffizi, what is quite beautiful is, here and there, within that museum, you find those traces. Because you have that Roman relief of the 1st century before Christ, where you have a scene of a bacchanal, but where you see that it's a relief in marble, but you see that the sculptor has created this body, but the sense of movement is conveyed by the textile. And in a way you say, okay, Botticelli must have seen this, and this must have been the model for his 3 graces. Or when you look at all the various nudes that would have been collected by the Medici, the classics, the classical statues, the fragments that the Medici and other influential families would have collected, you can see the artists of the time, the Botticelli, the Donatello, Bertoldo di Giovanni, using these as examples. And today when you visit the museum or you go to the Bargello, you have these examples and you're connecting to these examples. Correct. And that is so, and you find these traces here and there, and in a way you can make those connections by finding those associations. But what you're associating is something that was done 1,400 years earlier to something that has been rediscovered 1,400 years later. Because they were collecting all this information. Because they were collecting the information, and the artists were looking at this new way of representing. And this fantastic representation. Because if, for me, Botticelli's Birth of Venus anatomically is extremely bizarre, his masterpiece is his representation of the 3 graces, in my mind, because it's dynamic, because it's sensual, because the veils and the textile is giving you that beautiful sense of light movement, of lightness, of dance, of femininity. Yes, a lot of femininity, which wasn't that much painted during that time. No, so it's that celebration way of the female body, always in an idealized manner, because it is femininity, but it's ideal femininity. And the representation of the body in Florence. Of Michelangelo, there's 3 beautiful examples in Florence. First, the Battle of the Centaurs, which is in Casa Buonarroti, in which he creates 24 male nude figures in this very dynamic representation of a battle between men and centaurs, and it's amazing. And Michelangelo was 16, 17 when he sculpts that. Then another extraordinary example of nude is his Bacchus in the Bargello, where you have, like in Donatello, the representation of a very ambiguous, very non-muscular, very decadent representation of the body now, which this Bacchus is forcing, and Michelangelo is forcing gravity, pushing him to the extreme, and you have the total perception of a totally drunk young man. Poor Bacchus will have his attributes chopped off in a later phase, so we do not see him in his full nudity, which would have been what Michelangelo would have sculpted. And then Michelangelo's David, which is the first monumental male nude statue since antiquity. And his David is clearly connecting to the canons of classical art, of the Apollos, and it's connecting to extraordinary anatomical detail, the representation of the veins, the representations of the body, but he's still also using some of the canons of Greek statuary, so some of the tricks of Greek statuary, for example, that detail here on the
pelvis.
On the pelvis, yeah. Then always in Florence, another painting by Michelangelo in which we find an extraordinary representation, and for me an extraordinary connection, is the Tondo Doni, where in the backdrop you have those male nude figures. If you think of it, in the foreground you have the Virgin and Child, backdrop you have the male nude figures that are sitting, leaning against a structure, a wall, maybe quarries, and they are representing the pagan world. But what is so beautiful about that is that Michelangelo had been to Rome, and he is citing the Lacaonte, the elderly priest, that beautiful Greek statue that you find in the Belvedere of the Vatican, where you have Lacaonte, which is the Greek priest, which is a muscular, powerful figure, and his two sons being eaten by the snake and being destroyed by the snake, remember? And Michelangelo is citing that in that painting. And he's also citing the Apollo Belvedere. So, to shut the circle, you have Michelangelo, who is connecting directly to where we started from, ancient Greece, and ancient Greek statuary. And from that moment on, in Italian art, the nude will then develop and will acquire and will become a very powerful language in Italian art. I'm always using Florence as an example because I work in Florence, so. But if we want to see the evolution of the female form, so we've spoken about the three graces in Botticelli and about the Venus of Botticelli, but then where is the next step? We find the next step in the representation of the female body in Titian's Venus of Urbino. And it's always the idea of the pudic Venus that will be exploited by artists into the 1800s with the Olympia, with the Maja Desnuda. No? So it will be exploited throughout. And what does Titian do? In my mind, he manages to sensualize the female body in an extraordinary manner. And when I say sensualize, I don't want to give a negative connotation to how I'm expressing myself. But sometimes when I go in there and I have clients who are a bit open-minded, I will go, look, this is Playboy, front central page 1500s, because that's what it is. What you're seeing is a painting that is depicting a woman clearly indicated for a male gaze, which is clearly connected to a certain cultural environment in which that woman, and here's the novelty of Titian, is doing something that we do not see any other woman in that time frame doing when represented in the nude, which is she's staring out towards the observer, and she is engaging the observer with that gaze. And it's her gaze that breaches the frame and that connects to the observer that is the extraordinary novelty of that painting, and that makes her a heavily erotic type of image. If you, for example, walking by our museums, if you look at in the 1500s, there's a proliferation of nudity, whether male or female, using obviously always as an excuse classical myth. No one within those paintings is ever looking outside. The gaze is always enclosed within the painting. The gaze is always directed inside the painting to the other figures, but the gaze does not breach the frame, and the gaze is not calling and attracting.
Like the Mona Lisa. Is that gaze breaks the frame, doesn't it?
Yes, but it has a different nuance to it.
Yeah, it's not seduction.
Here you can stare at that painting for hours, and you're constantly falling on those eyes that are leading you and are calling you, and it is so intentional. She's empowered. She knows her power. She knows her power as a woman. And you got to think of the environment of the 1500s, of the courtesans in Venice. Courtesans in Venice weren't women of no consequence. They were extremely powerful women who were in the most important circles, and because they were in the most important circles, they also had extraordinary influence. And that woman, for me, or that representation, for me, is, yes, sexualized. I don't see her as naked. I see her more as nude. So another thing that is interesting about that painting, one of the possible interpretations is that she is a woman who has just had sex, in the sense that her cheeks are flushed, her pupils dilated, her hand that is hiding but not hiding, and everything is, and then the flowers falling, the roses falling from her hand, and everything is implying this deflowering, not the idea that immediately emerges is, deflowering. But the thing that is interesting, and here is the key, is that in the 1500s in Venice, you used to use the term deflowered, not as we use it today. It's not a woman who's deflowered, rather, it's that tradition by which noble Venetians or rich Venetians would send their sons to be educated in sexuality to courtesans. Because the term deflowered in the 1500s Venice did not refer to a woman, but referred to the flowering of a man. So it's quite beautiful. I find that quite beautiful, not because it's a paradigm that is totally reversed from what we usually assume. So you have the impression that, I look at her as this woman who has just educated a young Venetian boy on the ways of sexuality, and that's why for me she has power. She's not defeated.
Mm-mm.
And it's a totally new way of conveying the female body. Thank you.